The following podcast is taken from a live broadcast on Inspire FM.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Book Club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood and we are here with another show, an amazing guest and a brilliant book. And I'm really looking forward to having some really important conversations today. We are in the online studio today with Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. So Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan is a writer, poet, educator and activist, disrupting ideas of history, race, knowledge and violence. Her poetry performances based on her book Post-Colonial Banter have millions of views online, and she was the National Roundhouse Poetry Slam runner-up in 2017. Suhaiymah has written for The Guardian and Galdem, and her work has featured across radio and TV stations. She has been commissioned to write plays by theatres, including the Royal Court. So that is an amazing introduction to our beautiful guest. And we are discussing Suhaiymah's book, Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. And definitely we know from the recent from listening to news and the media and etc., there is a big push at the moment for us to recognise Islamophobia and its impacts. More so, I think, at a government level as well. So hopefully today's show will give you a bit of insight into the book itself, a bit more, understanding of what Islamophobia is and how we really need to challenge, the institutions of power and start making, hopefully a positive difference. So I'm going to say Assalamu alaikum to Suhaiymah.
Walaikum assalam. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to speak to us. How has your morning been so far?
Been good. It's been busy. I had COVID last week, so I'm catching up on classes and things that I've missed. So I'm trying to cram everything into my mornings at the moment. But it's been good. How about you?
Yes, no, alhamdulillah, we've been okay. And I think, we kind of think we're coming out of this pandemic and this idea of getting back to normal, but it's not quite there. And this whole idea of new normal is definitely something, I guess, that it's an interesting conversation to have. But yeah, so coming on to your book, Tangled in Terror. So I'm really looking forward to speaking about this book today. But I guess the starting point really for our listeners, I wanted to know, because obviously that the biography I shared, you're a writer, you're a poet, you've been writing for theatre. What has kind of inspired you to get into writing?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I don't have like a really straightforward answer. I think writing is, and like I'm sure a lot of writers will say, it's something that I've always done, often for myself. I guess that's how I've always processed my feelings and my thoughts. I've always been a journal keeper. I've always kind of, my notes app in my phone is just full of so many random things. I've always loved reading. I think that there's always a clear connection there. Matilda used to be my favorite childhood film. I think like those kind of classic tropes, I guess. But I think writing is probably the place where I feel like I can articulate myself the best. And so I think initially writing kind of for a public audience, for a wider audience, was a desire to explain things that I felt weren't being explained properly, to kind of cast a light on or reveal the things that kind of it felt were being brushed over and obscured. And often that was to do with racism, that was to do with Islamophobia, that was often to do with my own experiences of those things. And as time has gone on, I've kind of seen that different types of writing do different things as well. And that's really exciting to me, because a poem might reach somebody that isn't reached by, an academic article that's written in kind of, difficult jargon. So I think writing has a lot of power, and it does move people and it changes ideas. And for me, if we're trying to change the world, then, you have to change people's minds and you have to change. That's where you start. So I guess it's kind of basic inspiration, but I do just feel like writing there's so many different things it can do. And I think we've all read something, haven't we, in our lives that's moved us. And so that, to me, the fact that it can do something that powerful makes me want to, keep trying to do something with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And because there's a form of it being really accessible, isn't it? So, and that's what's so amazing, the fact that, whether it is through poetry or whether it's through an academic paper or, through a book itself. So, I mean, even in terms of your writing journey, obviously you were part of the book, Fly Guide Girls to University. Then obviously there's your poetry collection, Post-Colonial Banter. But what was specific in the reason for this current book now, Tangled in Terror?
So actually, this is part of a series of books that Pluto Press have done. It's called the
Mm,
Outspoken series, and the idea of this whole series for them is that it's for young people by young people. A lot of the authors of the series are kind of activists themselves, and they're supposed to be really accessible. That's the key thing about these books. These are not academic books.
mm,
And so actually, it was Pluto who approached me, kind of being like, you are young, you're an activist, you're a
mm,
writer. Like, would you be interested in writing about Islamophobia for this series? And I thought that was an amazing idea, just because I don't actually think, and I mean, I would ask anyone listening, can you think of a single book about Islamophobia that is not an academic book, that is widely accessible, and that kind of covers all the different facets of it? And when I thought about that question, I was like, no, there's absolutely nothing out there. I've
mm,
never grown up with a kind of rigorous analysis and a clear kind of picture of what is it that we're facing, whether you're Muslim or not Muslim. I think there's just no real Islamophobia is simply kind of this. It's
mm,
like a moral deficiency. It's something that's not great. It's not. You shouldn't really be mean to Muslims. That's not nice. We know that it manifests in verbal harassment. We know that it manifests sometimes in physical attacks. That's really the limit of where the conversation is, and at least in the mainstream. And so I think it is really it's necessary. This kind of I just felt like this book is necessary. We really actually deserve a bigger analysis, because with a bigger analysis, then you can start to hold institutions to account. You can start to kind of draw connections between the different parts of the establishment or industries that uphold Islamophobia. So I just felt like it was a really important kind of it's almost like it's a service that we all need. It's a tool that we all need. And that felt really like necessary to me.
yeah, no, definitely. And because I think about myself and, having, experienced that transition, especially around, 9/11. And actually, you're right. If I guess it's only just coming to my mind now that there's nothing really, or there hasn't been anything out there, and because that's what we need sometimes. We need to be able to, have something we can, well, not just relate to. And I know sometimes using the word empower is really problematic, but it is that, because when you see somebody, or whether it's Pluto Press or any other kind of platform, really kind of championing that kind of writing, yeah, it's like you said, we absolutely deserve it. And it's such an important time, I think, for this book
Yeah.
to be coming out as well. Now, obviously, in terms of Inspire FM, we have predominantly Muslim audience, but I never want to make the assumption that we all understand Islamophobia. Yeah, we might have experienced it, but just for context a little bit, can you share the history of maybe where Islamophobia maybe's come out of, and this idea and narrative of that we
Sure.
have of Muslims being a threat?
Yeah, no, I think, and the thing is, I think it is like you say, actually, whether we're Muslim or not, I think there's an assumption that we kind of know what it is, and that's really at the heart of this book, is that actually I don't know that we do. And so often when we talk about the history of Islamophobia, people start at 9/11, right? And they kind of go that, 9/11 is the moment that Islamophobia kind of was birthed. And what I think is more important to focus on, and what I try and do in this book, is say, actually, let's go further back in time, because for me, Islamophobia is just one kind of manifestation of what colonialism has always done and always did. And so when I try and trace this history, what I say is, look, let's go as far back as sometimes when we think about racism, any type of racism, we kind of assume that racism exists because races exist, right? Because we're split into races. But the argument I try and make is that actually it's the other way around. Racism is justified by inventing different races, by saying, look, these people look like this, they have different cultures, they have different behaviors, they have different ways of being, and therefore they are lesser than us, they're less human, they're less valuable, whatever, and therefore we can invade their lands, we can steal their resources, whatever. And so Islamophobia is actually, if you think about it, it's just a manifestation of that same type of history. And so, you've got kind of historians who have traced this, whether that's through Orientalism, imperialism, the characterization of Muslim people and Muslim places throughout history, far before 9/11, as, barbaric, as kind of excessive, as patriarchal, Muslim women as, submissive, or as exotic, as kind of the harems of Muslim women, all the kind of tropes that we hear today about Muslims that we're quite familiar with in news stories and tabloids and whatever else, they actually you can go hundreds of years back and you can find them. And I think that's really fascinating, because it tells us that this is not just something new, and this is something that's always actually justified, or whether it's foreign policy goals or whether it's just the way that the West wants to characterize itself. Muslims have often been a foil to the West. So you can talk about Islam and you talk about Muslims as being backwards in order to say, look how modern and kind of democratic and whatever else we are. And so Muslims just become, in a way, a mirror for the West, a way for the West to kind of say what they're not. And we see that to this day, right? And Muslims are terrorists, and therefore the violence that is perpetrated by the West or Western states, that's just security, that's just peacekeeping, that's just democracy, that's just liberty. And so I think tracing that longer history is really important. I mean, there's way more that I can say, and I think we must always connect Islamophobia to anti-Black racism and to kind of all of the different manifestations of racism that exist, because these things are not isolated and they're not disconnected. And it's by drawing that long history that I believe we can also actually resist Islamophobia from its root. And that's something that's really important, right? Not just looking at the surface level, kind of tip of the iceberg ways that we see Islamophobia, but thinking, hang on, why does it exist? Who does it benefit? Who does it serve? And that's kind of the questions I'm really interested in.
Yeah, and it's such a crucial point actually you've made, that this idea that history is long, right? It goes really way back, and that constant shedding light on the link to colonialism and everything that did do and is currently still doing, right? Because it's still manifesting itself for sure. Now, obviously we know, especially living in the UK, the government's I guess focus on like counter extremism and everything that's kind of come with it, because they have this thing about it's international security, right? And obviously you speak about this in your book, Tangled in Terror. Now, what can we do to kind of challenge this thing that it's international security, so this is what we need?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we all, I think many of your listeners will know and agree that we've been told that this thing called international security, it is always the right thing to do, and it's always justified, even when we've seen millions of people killed. We've seen people's countries invaded, we've seen drones dropped, and we've seen so many more displaced, right? The current so-called refugee crisis, where you're seeing, just so many people fleeing from all parts of the world, often is directly connected to wars and invasions that are apparently to make the world safer and more secure from violence. And so one of the kind of questions that I'm raising throughout my book, Tangled in Terror, is that in the name of keeping us safer, who has actually been made safe? Because most of the world's most marginalized, people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Yemen, you name it, Syria, they have all been made more unsafe. Lives have often been destroyed. And it seems really disingenuous to me that this is in the name of countering violence. Because what that really tells me is that not you, but like the West or Western states have created a narrative that violence is a thing that is unique and a natural disposition of Muslims, right? So even in the coverage we've seen recently of, Russia's war in Ukraine, we hear lots of media spokespeople kind of making the comparison that this war matters because this isn't Afghanistan, this isn't Iraq, this isn't Syria. We can welcome these refugees because, in other words, they're not Muslim. And that's really fascinating to me, because what it tells me is that the war on terror, the whole language of it, for 20 years of the war on terror, has created this idea that Muslim people and Muslim places are deserving of violence and deserving of destruction and war, because ultimately they're not really people. They're really all just suspects. They're really all just people who might one day be terrorists, versus or compared to people in the West who actually, their valuable lives, their lives that we see as, grievable, as losable. And so this language of international security actually masks a really violent, really oppressive project. And that's why I think we need to be really careful about the language that we use. And we shouldn't just accept the terms of governments. And we should ask, well, actually, who has been made safer? Is it actually just governments that have made themselves more secure against protest? Is it actually, arms trades, industries that sell drones and industries that sell surveillance technologies that have been made more secure in the name of saying they were protecting us?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to interrogate it. And, what you've mentioned about, the current coverage of the, Ukraine and Russia in terms of journalists and the biases and the blatant racism, which is just being on like full display. I mean, it gets to a point where you just think it surely can't get any worse. And then it just gets more worse than you can imagine. It's
like a parody,
yeah, it honestly. And and obviously you're speaking about governments and what is really the agenda, I guess. And, again, it's something, you touch on your book as well. And obviously we've got this big thing in terms of the prevent duty. Now, if that's something that is, for years since its inception, it's been presented as this kind of means to eradicate extremism. And obviously there's this thing that, it's regardless of faith, the background, etc. But we know, obviously, that it targets specifically Muslims.
Yeah.
But obviously at the same time, the point is it is a statutory duty. So is there really a realistic way of, I guess, empowering colleagues or people that we know to counter the damage that the prevent duty is kind of committing at the moment?
I think that's such a good question because, yeah, I think that the stage we've reached in the conversation around prevent is clear that it's completely, it's racist, it racially profiles. I think even just last week, the People's Review of Prevent was, launched, and it documents, in painstaking detail, like the ways in which prevent is not only racist, but, it actually undermines safeguarding, it actually undermines like equality, protected characteristics, et cetera, et cetera. So the question you're asking, what can we actually do, is a crucial one. And it's one that, even in writing the book, I got to interview different people and kind of ask them their thoughts on this question. And I think ultimately, this is a matter of like coming together. When you're trying to repeal a piece of legislation that is legal, right, that, as you've said, is a legal duty, it's really difficult to convince people that, well, just, don't participate in it, because people feel like, well, my job is on the line, I can't just, I've got bills to pay, I've got a family to feed, etc., etc. And I think the point here is that we need to actually, this needs to be like a first, a shift that we make in language, like the ways we talk about prevent. We should never concede that it's acceptable. And secondly, we can all make demands, right? Whether or not you have to legally uphold prevent or not, you can make a demand that it should be repealed, and you can come together with other people. And so whether that's within unions, whether that's beyond unions, I think if we actually kind of spread that message that this is unacceptable, that we refuse to be legally obliged to racially profile our students, our patients, I think that will shift things. But ultimately, it's not. I think we have to kind of move out of the bubble of it being like this is only affecting Muslims, that prevent is only a Muslim. Because I think sometimes the reason we're not getting a communal kind of really broad-based resistance is this idea that, well, it's like something that's just, I don't know, Muslims are saying it's affecting them, I don't know, is it? But we actually need to say, well, yes, it is Islamophobic, but actually it's not just that it's Islamophobic, it's that what are the far-reaching consequences if you accept that teachers and that doctors and librarians and whatever else, that they are all actually, that they should all work for the state as spies, that we should all look out in one another, we should treat one another as suspects of potential future criminals. What are the kind of ramifications of that for everyone more broadly? We've already seen prevent be used against environmental activists, student protesters, anything basically that the government doesn't want. And so I think if people don't make those larger connections, then we're not going to really build a broad-based kind of resistance. But these are really live questions, and I think, I don't have the answers to that specifically, but my intuition, my feeling is we have to keep just making the demand, and we have to do it more and more collectively.
Yeah, and that's obviously where that collective voice is important, because even if we're all just doing it at an individual level where we're kind of challenging, it could be just having a conversation with a colleague, or in your own socializing time, and whatever might come up. It is just about, I guess, standing for justice, I guess. I mean, I remember this is years and years ago, I did some work as a clerk for a governing board, and a prevent officer had been invited in to do, like a presentation, etc. And it showed the governors this graph which had there was no labeled axes. It was just one straight line showing, oh yeah, the number of children going off to Syria. No one questioned it. And this is the head teacher and obviously other members of staff, and and that was when it really drove home about, that if we're not questioning it, or and teachers, whether it's their own bias or whether they don't feel safe enough to, definitely you're right, it has much more further or far-reaching consequences.
And that's such a good point though as well, just asking questions. I think that story you've just given is so symbolic of the broader logic of prevent, which is that, hey, just believe that this kind of does prevent violence, when actually all the science shows that it doesn't. All these academics kind of say that this has no basis, there's no peer-reviewed study that kind of says anything about this being justifiable. And so actually, if people don't feel kind of confident enough to like outright kind of condemn prevent, actually asking those important questions to your colleagues, like, why do where are you getting this from? Why did you not hear that like this is completely discredited? That can also be a way sometimes, if you're not entirely feeling confident, to shift the conversation still.
Absolutely. No, definitely. And just kind of following now on from that. So in your book, Tangled in Terror, I think it's chapter 5, and you kind of explore this theme of British values, right? Which is, as soon as I say those two words, I can't control how I feel. But I guess the question really is, and I'm just going to link this actually to obviously a recent podcast by New York Times Serial and Brian Reed and Hamza Syed, obviously, which is the Trojan Horse affair. Because obviously, this idea of British values comes up in that and what that actually means. And I guess I wanted really your opinion. Firstly, what you thought maybe of the podcast, if you listened to it, but also more kind of, specifically, this discourse around British values, how has that, I guess, exacerbated this, counter-extremism, which obviously we just spoke about before?
Yeah. Firstly, the podcast, yes, I did listen, and I thought it was, I mean, as with lots of people who listen, I think it was just gobsmacking, even though it wasn't surprising. We all knew even at the time that this is completely just Islamophobia at play. But I think just going, seeing the details of the fact that the letter behind the Trojan Horse scandal was completely fake, that it was just so much like an interpersonal drama, and that the government knew that Michael Gove was told by police that this is a bogus letter, we don't recommend you do anything. And he went ahead and was like, actually, I want to be as Islamophobic as possible and destroy people's lives. It is, it's devastating, actually. I think if you allow yourself to sit with that, the feeling I had was that this is so painful, that our communities are so uncared for, really, ultimately, that our children can just be left to have nothing. And that pain is really like heavy on all of us, I think. And really it's linked to the second part of your question, which is, what has the impact been of the British values kind of narrative? And we will all know, if you're a Muslim in this country, you'll know that the impact of that narrative has been massive. That now apparently, learning British values is a kind of a necessary requirement for people to not become extreme. Extremism, the only definition that you will find in government kind of papers of extremism itself is, people going against British values. What are British values? Apparently, democracy, rule of law, toleration. These are values that the British government every day undermines itself, right? Illegal wars, illegal occupations, deportation, stripping people of citizenship, making them stateless, which is a direct violation of human rights. Like, the list is endless of the ways that the government itself doesn't uphold these so-called values. But what it really does is it means that as racialized people, so people of color in this country in general, we're now seen as constantly, potentially, our Britishness is always in question, right? And the ramifications of that aren't just like, you might be asked to, you might be told go back where you came from, that kind of standard racism. But the ramifications of that are bigger, because really what we're seeing is people's entire kind of place in this country coming into question. Do you even have a right to be here? There was a report into social integration in 2016, 2017, I think, Louise Casey's report. And one of the really interesting lines in that I always like to pick out is that she said that in areas where there are high concentrations of ethnic minorities, people are less likely to develop British values. Now, what she doesn't say in the report is that in areas where there are high concentrations of white people, or schools like private schools, or areas that are majority white, people will be less likely to develop British values. So by virtue of not saying that, what she's implying is that if you are white in this country, you're born with these values, and therefore you're never going to be deemed at risk of radicalization or a potential threat or criminal in the future. If you're a person of color in this country, whether or not you were born here, you're constantly it's a question mark around you, right? Like, do you really have a right to just live your life freely, or should we always suspect you? And will we always ask you to be constantly proving, whether that's at school, whether it's at work, whether it's throughout your entire life, that you deserve to be here? And when the actual legal consequences exist in terms of you actually can't, right now, the Nationality and Borders Bill is going through one of its final readings in Parliament. And this is a bill that will allow people's citizenships to be stripped secretly, just because the Home Secretary believes that, you're not conducive to the public good. And then you might never know the reason for that, because it will say on national security grounds, we can't tell you. So when you have real ramifications that people can lose their citizenship, then it's no kind of like small matter that this British values narrative that came out of the Trojan Horse affair, which was a lie, what that really tells us is that, like, for no reason, people of color in this country are being punished simply to uphold like a really oppressive regime, and to make sure that nobody's allowed to dissent and protest, because that's ultimately it, right? You are not allowed to dissent or protest against the government, because if you do, well, hang on, are you running contrary to British values here? Like, do you not, are you saying that you are against what Britain stands for, when you're actually saying what I'm for is justice and what I'm seeing is injustice? So yeah, it's absolutely, to me, it's just infuriating.
Yeah, I mean, I just think like it is infuriating. I just think also like the level of exhaustion, but I it's because it is that I feel like it's something that I've grown up with. I now have children, and I think, how am I meant to protect them, with everything that's kind of out there, and the direction it's headed. But obviously, just bringing it back and how important it is at an individual level that we're challenging it. And obviously the book that you've written, Tangled in Terror, that is it's not obviously a starting point. It's almost in kind of this whole I just don't know, like journey of where we're at. It's just a really crucial point, I think, and it's so important, to at least be having these conversations. And we are approaching the end of the first half of the show. So we are in the studio with Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, who is the author of Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. So you will join us in a few moments after the break, and we'll talk a lot more about some of these themes, and just a little bit more about, Suhaiymah's kind of activism and hopefully hopes for the future. So join us in a few moments. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum, this is Atif Nawaz. Listen to Inspire FM shows in your time by heading over to inspirefm.org or listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the Book Club show on Inspire 105.1 FM. My name is Imrana Mahmood, and on today's show we are joined in the studio by Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan, who is a writer, poet, educator and activist. Now what we are going to continue obviously our conversation about the book and some other themes as well. But before that, I just did want to ask Suhaiymah, how does your faith kind of play a role in, what you're doing? Obviously you've written this book and you're kind of challenging I guess the problems out there in society, but what role does your faith play in that?
Every role. Like, I would say I would not be doing this if I was not Muslim. For me, like, even just writing this book, it was like, should I bother, should I not? And I think, it comes back to really simple things, like with whatever Allah has gifted you with, whatever skills you have, whatever kind of resources you have, we have to use them, right? Like, I always think of the ayah, I won't try and say the Arabic, but just oh, you who believe, stand up firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, whether it's against yourself, your kin, your parents, rich or poor, etc., etc. And I think about the fact that literally, doing justice is incumbent upon us, no matter how kind of difficult, how uncomfortable, how awkward. And we're living in a time when it is quite uncomfortable and awkward to do justice, right? To speak about justice, because you might be punished for it, you might be kind of reprimanded, you might be isolated. So that really inspires me. And the other thing is, sometimes people ask, how do you stay optimistic, right? Like, we're living in such difficult and dark times, and we see so much oppression across the world. How do you have optimism? And so, I mean, even into the opening of the conclusion of this book, Tangled in Terror, I start with the opening ayah of Surah Falaq, and I say, why would we've got a God, we've got a creator who says to us, say I seek refuge in the Lord of the daybreak, right? Like, what does that mean? That the day will break is the kind of message I get from that. That actually, no matter kind of how difficult and how long this night may seem, this darkness, the day will break, and that's by Allah's will. It's with our effort, but it's by Allah's will. And I think that's, for me, that's the thing that drives me when it comes to what you've asked. It's that it's ultimately not up to us, right? Like, we struggle, and that's I think the job upon us, the duty upon us, is to resist, is to struggle, is to speak back. But actually, the ending of the oppression, that's in God's hands. And I think that, for me, is a really hopeful and reassuring thing, because it means that the onus is on us to only do what we can, right? To do what is possible for us to do. But the value of what we do doesn't rest in whether or not we actually end every tyranny on this earth, because that's in Allah's hands. So yeah, to me, actually, that Islam is the thing that makes it possible to have hope, makes it possible to resist, makes it worthwhile. Because I mean, what is the point of being on this earth in these times if we're simply just going to look away and close our eyes? And I do believe, if we think we're accountable, that one day I'm going to stand before God and kind of have to answer for what I've seen and what I witnessed here, then actually it's also a really scary and urgent matter. It's not just something that's kind of like, oh, my faith inspires me. It's like, this is literally like, probably one of the most important questions of our lives. Like, what will we do with what we see? how we respond to it. So yes, a lot is the answer.
Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. And it's so true. And I think that's one of the things we only have to look back at prophetic stories and this idea of standing up to the oppressor and that's, seeking justice is such a vital part of being human almost, right? And because obviously injustice to some extent, is kind of touching on what you said, Will, and tyranny that it's always been almost part and parcel of what the dunya is, and I guess it's kind of discerning and making those intentions. So that's amazing. Thank you. And I mean, you touched upon it already, this idea of resistance and maybe just going a bit more deeper into that. We are obviously in a moment, obviously, yes, we want to be hopeful, but, increasing hostile environment, in terms of, and obviously I'm talking about UK specifically because that's where we're based. So what, does active resistance look like? Is it, what you mentioned about just, speaking up, or is there anything else,
I think it's a really, again, this is like one of the difficult questions, right? And this is something that I also asked. So in writing the book, I got to interview a lot of people, and a lot of these people really inspire me because they are doing what I would call active resistance. And so these are people who, have, a lot of them have been detained. Some, sometimes it's like in Guantanamo Bay, sometimes it's like in the UK somewhere, sometimes it's just overnight in a prison, but they've been detained without charge, without trial. These are people who have kind of had their entire lives like turned upside down, people whose homes have been raided, whose children have PTSD, people who've been through the real extremities of, they've faced the violence of the state and they've had no accountability. They've had no recourse to justice. Nobody will kind of touch their cases or help them. And the reason I mentioned that when you're asking what active resistance looks like is that actually their ability to persevere, to me, that is resistance. Their ability to come back from that kind of just oppression and that kind of violence, and to say, I still believe that life is worth fighting for. I still believe that we can demand justice, even though I've never seen it, I've never experienced it. That I find really inspiring. And I think that's a type of active resistance, persevering, continuing to reveal the lies, the injustices, even like I mentioned earlier, the review into Prevent, the People's Review. I think even though it can feel like we've just had this conversation about Prevent so much, it's so overdone, I think it still matters to keep not give up, because I think in a way it's like a war of attrition that we're in, right? That actually I think the expectation is we'll just give up, we'll just shut up, we'll just get tired because it is so tiring. And actually, so perseverance, I think, is a type of active resistance. And one of the calls to action that I make in the book is that actually I say to people, look, there's so many things that feel too big for any of us to do. We all have lives, we're all busy. But one thing that we can all do is think really carefully about the language that we use. And I think when it comes to Islamophobia in particular, something I would ask everyone to do is be really curious about the words that we use to describe things. And in the book, I never use the word terror or terrorism without using quotations, because I actually think we can't just accept the terms of kind of governments and states who call, individual perpetrators who commit acts of violence terrorists, but call themselves, when they deport, deny, detain, whatever, murder, invade, they don't call that violence, they don't call that terror. And so simple things like that do matter, like thinking about the language that we use, because that kind of seeps into the ways that we understand the world, and it seeps into, more importantly, the ways that the people that we talk to understand the world. So if you refuse to adhere to the language of the status quo and you instead start using other language, you actually kind of raise questions and disrupt the kind of straightforward narratives people might have in their heads. So I think that's something that like all of us can do. And another thing that I think active resistance looks like is obviously direct kind of actions, like we must demand the repeal of certain pieces of legislation. But importantly, I think we have to make connections, in the sense that and one of the really important things for me when it comes to understanding Islamophobia is that the end goal, the horizon for us, cannot simply be, for example, once Prevent and counter-extremism measures are repealed, job done, Islamophobia over. No, because this is a global type of violence. This is really, Islamophobia is just imperialism, in other words. So until our siblings across the globe are free from violence, then, that's not the end. But secondly, that it can't only be limited to the kind of the ways that kind of disproportionately harm Muslims. If we realize that Prevent is bad, for example, we have to realize that any preemptive form of policing that says that a crime is associated with a certain type of person is unjust. And so we have to actually start questioning and being against and asking for the repeal of any stop and search laws, right? Any type of surveillance, any type of injustice. And I think that's something that can happen, again, as you said earlier, Imran, like in the conversations that we have with our own colleagues, peers, friends, families, and those things, they spread and they go wider and wider, and shifting the conversation is such an important part of shifting anything. No major kind of change in history has happened without people just changing the ways they understand it. Because when enough people decide, actually this is not okay, this is unacceptable, then you start seeing the material reaction and the reflection in reality. And if those people who face the extremity of state violence can persevere and can do that and can believe every day that it's worth doing, then I think those of us who haven't experienced those extremities must also be responsible for doing that. And that, to me, those things together are what active resistance could look like.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, what you said is quite vital in terms of, specifically with language, because I guess, it's something, I think about, and, we see it in the media, right? That they use speech marks as soon as they use the word, I don't know, Palestinian struggle, and you might find the word struggle in, and it's really interesting, you're right, to almost subvert that and say, actually, that, we have ownership of language as much as anybody else, and really questioning it. And yeah, I guess everything you said in terms of, perseverance and all of those things, because I think maybe in my mind, to me, even when I asked the question, I was thinking, what's active resistance look like, what do we have to do, and but actually you're right, it's continuing to exist despite, I guess, everything that's being kind of, you're being bombarded with, and then you're being attacked with, and even in terms of the word violence, violence doesn't always, it's not just physical. I mean, there's so much else that is at play, and in terms of how those things happen. So no, for sure, that's definitely a lot to think about. I guess one of the other things is another kind of chapter in your book, Tangled in Terror, and I know we touched upon a little bit already in terms of your faith as a Muslim, etc. But I guess I'm thinking more specifically, this idea of being the other, right? Because that's how we're always constantly presented as people of color. And there's been, whole conversations for years and years about integration and actually, even to assimilate to an extent to be accepted. How has that played out for you, maybe on a personal level, if you're kind of comfortable sharing that? I mean, that'd be interesting.
Well, I actually think this really links to what you just said a second ago as well, and the sense of, what we were just saying about like perseverance, that being a form of resistance. Because I think as Muslims, one of the kind of maybe more subtle routes in which we've seen kind of, you just said there's violences of different types, right? I think one of the things that we've seen is there has been an active attempt to co-opt what Islam is. And I don't mean that in a way that's like to sound really conspiratorial, but I mean that in the sense as simple as, I remember growing up, one of the biggest refrains that I ever heard was, Islam means peace, Islam means peace, Islam means peace. Now, Islam does not mean peace, right? First off, it means submission, to submit to Allah. But second off, why did we feel the need to define Islam only in relation to the violence that is assumed to be attached to it? To me, that already is a concession that says that we will define Islam on the terms of the oppressors. We will start changing the narrative about what Islam really is to basically, like you said, be more acceptable, to be more palatable, to not raise questions, not make people feel uncomfortable. And my point isn't that like, oh, we always need to be provocative. My point is actually more that the ways that I've seen Islamophobia play out on us as Muslims is often really overlooked. I think we often talk about Islamophobia only in terms of like the racism, but one of the things that I try and place centrally in this book is that secularism is not just this idea of like an objective, neutral, separation of state and church, but that actually secularism is a part of colonialism, and it's an invented reality. Is this idea, and you can, I quote and trace many like kind of historical sources when I do this in the book, but in brief, that this idea that part of modernity is making religion something personal, about private conviction rather than something public, was actually a geopolitical kind of tool that was used by European states because they didn't want the church to have so much influence. At the same time, they were sending missionaries across the world to use, religion as a way to get a hold in other nations and as a way to kind of actually spread their imperialist conquests. So you have this contradiction that secularism was never what people kind of claim that it was. But secondly, that Europe has always said that its modernity, the thing that makes it superior to the rest of the world, is both the fact that apparently it's, secular, but also that it has this Christian heritage. And so, one of the people that I quote is a colonizer who says, he wrote, this is back in the 1800s, he writes that, when you look at Christians in the East, quote unquote, he's talking about kind of like, Egypt, he says that, the problem with the Christianity there is that it's been stagnated because it's been tainted by the influence of the Orientals, in other words, the Muslims and the Jewish people around. And I think that's fascinating because what it really says is that part of how Islam has always been seen is not just that, we're backwards, barbaric, patriarchal, etc., but that our religion itself, our beliefs themselves, are unsuitable and unfit for modernity. And that translates directly onto us right now. And that translates and has such direct consequences on our iman, on our actual faith, because what we're being told through these messagings, through these Islamophobic kind of narratives and ideas, is that Islam is basically unsuitable for these times. That if you genuinely believe there is a creator and you are created, that's embarrassing. You cannot simultaneously believe that and be intelligent. You cannot simultaneously believe that and be, British, a modern subject, a citizen, whatever else. So the impact on that on a personal level, I think we all can think about the ways that maybe we have tried to kind of make Islam seem more palatable, whether that's in a conversation with a colleague, with a friend, whether it's at school, whether it's feeling shame about what we actually believe, whether it's feeling that I need to play down, oh, I'm not going to pray, I'll just be 5 minutes, like I'll be back in a sec. And I think those are all actually really subtle and sinister impacts of Islamophobia on us as Muslim. And they're really hidden because I think we ourselves find it difficult to talk about because basically, it's not seen as a legitimate type of violence, right? Because we live in this context, it's not legitimate to say the most violent impact on me of Islamophobia has been the impact on my iman. And this has broader consequences. I mean, I'll wrap up in a second, but I just feel like there's so much to say about this because the impact is also that the conversations that we have in our masjids, in our madrasas, they also end up being on the terms of the Western states idea of Islam. So we start having all our conversations about, hey, look how great, Muslim contribution has been to the West. Look, we were scientists, we were alchemists, we were mathematicians. But why is it that the conversations we're having to have are about kind of proving we're intellectual, we're intelligent, we're scientific? That's only because there's a narrative that exists that says we are not. And it really breaks my heart because I feel like what conversations could we be having about Islam if it was on our own terms? It wouldn't always be about proving, oh, Muslim women have rights, we also have rights. We'd be able to have much more interesting, nuanced, deliberate conversations about the things we want to ask, the questions we have, rather than simply, ooh, can we kind of prove that Islam isn't backwards? Can we prove that we are as good as? And so to me, those are the deepest repercussions that I see. And I do a lot of poetry workshops in school with kids, and oftentimes when I work with Muslim kids, they're the things that break my heart because I see that the poems that they could write about anything, are not the poems they get to write, because the poems they get to write instead end up being really about trying to prove I'm just like you. I deserve humanity. I deserve value. I'm not a terrorist. I'm not sexist. I'm not XYZ. And that I actually think to me is one of the most painful parts of Islamophobia. That is one of the most under talked about. And that's something that I was really kind of passionate to include in this book.
Yeah, and it's making me really think as well, because for how long and how many of us have probably went through a phase of internalizing all those things, right? Because it was like this big massive machine, you were up against that, you were having to prove your worth and your humanity, etc. And obviously the poem that you won, the poetry slam for, kind of touched upon that as well. And I guess essentially what you've kind of I guess articulated really well is the distraction, right? The distraction this is all causing, where we can't even live, we can't just be, right? We just can't be because we're constantly feeling like we have to do all these things. And I guess maybe that's why, the book Tangled in Terror is so important, because for me, I guess I'm thinking, I'm so glad Suhaiymah's done the hard work, right? She's kind of articulated something really well and really challenging these things. And maybe now I can have a chance, my children can have a chance to say, look, we're not going to learn. I spend all the energy disproving something, that we're just going to talk about things. I mean, same with you. I've sometimes worked with young people, Muslim specifically, and just Muslim women, and just saying to them, look, just write what you want to write. And I remember the last project I did, it was very much for saying, if there's one story you could share with the world, what would it be? Like, forget everything for a moment, even though of course that's hard to do, but and I think it's about creating those platforms and opportunities, for us to be able to talk about those things. And I guess just kind of moving a little bit forward again in terms of now, I liked the kind of one of the chapters. I'm literally going to read it word for word, which is the feminist and queer friendly West, ? The patriarchal rest, ? Which I love the fact the chapter is just like 2 questions. But I guess what I wanted to ask, right, was there's definitely a selective amnesia, right, when it comes to the West, and it does, portray itself as being, more progressive, etc. And how everybody else, unless in our situation or specific to us, we're the opposite, like you said, backward or barbaric or however it's kind of presented. Now, what is the real kind of truth behind that narrative? You know, if you go specific to that chapter and what you kind of talked about.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess so. Even raising those questions of the title of the chapter, I'm trying to make people think it's less about saying, something I'm interested in is that I think it's actually less about saying what is the truth, like what is the reality, and more about saying why despite whatever the truth may be, does that narrative prevail? And the reason I say that is that because that narrative hides so much violence and it protects so many beneficiaries. So we just go with a really basic example, right? Which is that, the West is the place for women's rights, and that women have so much freedom here, and everybody comes, all women need to come to the West to be free, especially Muslims. Um, you just look at a simple reality, right? Like the fact that across so many European countries, there are bans on the clothes that women can wear to be in public spaces, right? These are sometimes they're not directly niqab and hijab bans, but in other words, they are. The reality of that means the impact of that is that Muslim women, whether or not you do wear niqab or hijab, you are hyper visible when you go into public space. That's not a great start to trying to feel super free and super safe. But secondly, that if you do wear an item of clothing that is banned, the West says you are not allowed to dress as you want to. We're feminists here, but you are not allowed to dress as you want to. And you are not allowed to participate in the public space, even though we say that as the West, this is a place where women can participate in public. So you see these immediate contradictions, and then you have like really, other obvious things like you've got in the UK you have Yarl's Wood Detention Centre, which for years has been notorious for the fact that women and children, asylum seeking people, are held here in absolutely disgusting, disgraceful conditions. Human rights violated at every step, mistreated and abused by prison guards. And again, this is in the home of apparently the most progressive, liberating place you can come. So the question becomes, for who? For who? For which women is this really a liberatory space? Who of us are allowed to feel, free? And I think the question then becomes about freedom as well, because I think actually one of the really interesting things, I mean, there's an amazing book by Sahar Gumkor, where she actually, I love the way that she just phrases this. She kind of says that one of the things that, especially the specter of like a Muslim woman who covers her body, the reason that's so scary and threatening and the cause of so much anxiety in the West is that actually what we're saying, in other words, is that actually, you know what, we're okay. Like, we're just going to define freedom on our own terms. We don't need the freedom that you're trying to shove down our throats. And she sort of says that is actually what's the word she uses? I love what she says. She's like, that is like unacceptable, and it's so like just it's so difficult to swallow that then you have to be punished. You have to be punished for that, right? That's not acceptable for you to say that you want freedom on other terms than what we've said is the most important and best version of freedom you can have. So I think the reason I'm talking about all of this and like to answer that question of like what's the truth of the narrative is that the truth is that this is just completely like a made up lie, but it's a lie made up because it has beneficiaries. States can then continue to force us to do things that are really violent, but it can say, no, 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 this is freedom, this is progress, this is making you feel better. And I wanted to talk about homophobia as well, and wanted to talk about kind of this idea that the West is queer friendly, because I think that's one of the increasing narratives that we see, right? That like Muslims are the source of kind of all oppression for queer people, but the West is like super super safe and great to be in. And I just thought like a really obvious example is the fact that every single day there are people who seek asylum in the UK because the countries that they are fleeing have laws that were usually put in place by the British Empire that say that homosexuality is illegal or there are these XYZ punishments, and they come to the UK seeking refuge, and the UK says no, and let's deport you back to that place where your human rights will be violated according to UN and EU conventions and that kind of thing. And so, regardless of I'm not even talking about Muslims for a second here. All I'm saying is that the direct contradiction between what the West says and then what it does. And so, how can you say that, hey, like, we're LGBTQ friendly, but at the same time, we literally deport queer people just who aren't white? And ultimately, what you see is that all of this is it's really just about race. It's about whiteness. It's that it's, the feminist and queer friendly West, when we're talking about whiteness, when it's a narrative that means that we can say, people of color deserve continual persecution and surveillance because they do not uphold the values that we apparently say we do uphold. And so, yeah, I mean, there's so much more. I mean, that chapter I found so hard to try and make it succinct because this is absolutely central. One of the things I think about a lot is that the way that Islam is marked as being different in the West is not what you'd think. It's not because it's like, oh, Muslims are religious and we're not. That's actually secondary, I would say, to the idea that Muslims are sexist and we are not. That actually seems to be the biggest kind of narrative difference about Muslims, and not even that came up so much throughout that Trojan Horse podcast, and even the rebuttals to it and the reactions to it. And it seems to be this ever kind of this thing that haunts, that we kind of always are, you know, and in that Muslim women just are silenced, right? Where there's no space for us to speak and get to say, well, hang on, are we allowed to like give our 2 cents on this? And I would say actually one of the biggest kind of, for me, painful consequences of that as well is that we don't get to say like any of the complicated truths. We don't get to say that, well, actually, maybe it's true that I experience, racism, Islamophobia, and sexism from a wider society, and maybe I also do experience sexism from Muslim people, because that might also exist because I live in a sexist world. Because as soon as you say that, that's going to be weaponized against you, and it'll be like, oh, see, we knew you lot were patriarchal. So then, where does that leave Muslim women? What it actually means is that the Western states that say they want to save us actually collude in keeping us silent, because they're saying, well, actually, no, you don't get to speak, because as soon as you speak, we'll just use that to say, well, let's criminalize your community further. So I feel like Muslim women are the ones who really, the most marginalized Muslim women are the ones who lose out the most, because nobody actually cares about us. And that's from, an apparently feminist West.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so, it is, and it's difficult, isn't it, being in that space and being, I guess, whether you're visibly Muslim or not, but just having that identity in itself is, I guess, it's that existence is brought into question. But then again, just coming back to the things that you're saying in terms of how the West is kind of presenting itself, but then what we can do, ourselves in terms of the work that we do, the conversations we're having, and the platforms, I guess, that we create for each other, and just making sure that we've got that supportive structure, at least on an intimate grassroots level, I guess, is really important. And inshallah, we can kind of build on that. We have reached the end of the show, and I just very quickly wanted to say, where can our listeners get a hold of a copy of Tangled in Terror?
So you can visit the Pluto Press website, but you can just Google Tangled in Terror. You should be able to get it from any book retailers, and you can even pop into your local bookstore, and if they don't have it, ask them to order it in. That would be awesome. And if anybody wants to have any more conversations about the book, I'd love to, please email me. My website is just suhaiymah.com. So yeah, please, I'd love to have more conversations about the book.
Fantastic. And we'd definitely love to have you back on, inshallah, in the future as well. But thank you so much, Suhaiymah. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you, and thank you for all your work as well. So that was Suhaiymah Manzoor-Khan. We were talking about Tangled in Terror, Uprooting Islamophobia. And please, obviously, get yourselves a copy of the book and start having conversations and making that difference, inshallah. And I will be back in a couple of weeks with a new book and, inshallah, a new author. So, assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Why not tune in to our live stream at inspirefm.org and follow and subscribe to our social media platforms at InspireFM Luton.